Long before Vlad III earned the name Tepes, the Impaler, the landscape of Wallachia was already shaped by fear, ambition, and constant pressure from powerful empires. The mid-15th century was not a time of peace. It was an age where borders shifted like sand, alliances collapsed overnight, and rulers survived only if they could balance diplomacy with force. Wallachia, a small principality between the Kingdom of Hungary and the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire, found itself caught in a political storm far larger than its size. The tension that built in these years would ultimately shape Vlad's worldview and prepare the ground for the brutal conflict that followed. The Ottomans were not merely a distant threat, they were an unstoppable machine pushing deeper into Europe. City after city fell to their armies, and their influence seeped across the Balkans like an incoming tide. For Wallachian rulers, independence was a fragile concept. To survive, many princes agreed to pay tribute to the Ottoman Sultan, a payment that purchased temporary peace but also confirmed their subordinate position. Vlad's own father, Vlad II Dracula, walked this tightrope with difficulty, trying to keep Wallachia intact while dealing with both Ottoman demands and Hungarian expectations. These dual pressures formed the backdrop of young Vlad's childhood. Yet the political tension was not simply external. Inside Wallachia, the boyars, powerful nobles, held enormous influence. Their allegiance shifted depending on who offered them more wealth or power. This made the throne unstable and made any prince vulnerable to betrayal. Growing up in such an environment taught Vlad that weakness was fatal and loyalty was not a guarantee but a luxury. Every leader who hesitated, who tried to compromise too much, or who failed to project strength eventually lost everything, sometimes their life, often their throne. When Vlad and his younger brother Radu were taken to the Ottoman Empire as political hostages, this tension took on a personal dimension. They were raised in the shadow of their father's precarious diplomacy, and for years their future depended entirely on Ottoman decisions. Vlad observed the discipline, organization, and ambition of the Ottoman military system. He witnessed how the empire functioned with strict hierarchy, unwavering authority, and a sense of destiny. Although he was not treated with cruelty, this experience left a lifelong mark. The Ottomans were not merely opponents, they were a powerful, looming force that could consume Wallachia if given the opportunity. When his father and older brother were murdered, events tied directly to Wallachian noble factions and political intrigue, Vlad's perspective hardened. He returned to Wallachia with a determination that went beyond the simple desire to rule. He wanted stability, absolute authority, and a Wallachia strong enough to resist manipulation from within and domination from outside. These early losses shaped his distrust of the boyars and his uncompromising stance toward the Ottomans. He saw both as threats that needed to be confronted with firm, decisive action. By the time Vlad reclaimed his throne in 1456, the Ottoman Empire was ruled by Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. The Sultan was young, ambitious, and determined to push Ottoman power deeper into Eastern Europe. Wallachia's position made it both strategically valuable and vulnerable. Mehmed expected tribute, military cooperation, and obedience. Any refusal was not seen as defiance from a small principality. It was seen as a challenge to the empire itself. Wallachia's geography also played a role in increasing the tension. The dense forests, rugged mountains, and narrow passes were easy to defend but difficult to control. Ottoman armies could march into the region, but maintaining control over such terrain required loyalty from the local population and nobility, something the Ottomans did not have. Vlad knew this and used it to his advantage. He understood that Wallachia's strength was not in numbers but in strategy, unpredictability, and psychological pressure. Economically, Wallachia was strained. Tribute payments to the Ottomans drained resources, especially during years of poor harvests or internal unrest. On top of this, Hungarian influence often demanded its own form of loyalty. Vlad found himself caught between two giants, both expecting allegiance. But unlike some of his predecessors, he refused to bow to both. He made a choice: He would fight for Wallachia's autonomy, even if that meant provoking the Sultan. This decision did not come from sudden impulse. It was the product of years spent observing the political dynamics of the region. Vlad understood the Ottomans' power, but he also recognized that no empire was invincible. Their military was formidable, but it required supply lines, morale and clear commands, things that Wallachia's dense terrain could disrupt. If he could weaken their presence, discourage further incursions, or show them that Wallachia was not a territory that could be subdued easily, he might protect his people from long-term domination. At the same time, Vlad recognized the importance of internal unity. A divided Wallachia stood no chance against external threats. The boyars, with their history of rebelling or switching allegiances whenever convenient, were an obstacle to this unity. Vlad's approach to governing them was firm, sometimes harsh, but in his eyes necessary. He needed a stable base of power before he could confront the Ottomans. The tension reached a boiling point when the Ottomans increased their demands. Sultan Mehmed II expected higher tribute payments, military support in campaigns, and the renewal of political hostages, this time Vlad's own younger brother. For Vlad, this was unacceptable. It was not merely a political insult, but a threat to Wallachia's independence. His refusal set off a chain reaction of diplomatic breakdowns, military preparations, and increasingly bold decisions. The Ottomans interpreted Vlad's resistance as rebellion. Vlad interpreted Ottoman pressure as a violation of sovereignty. Both sides saw themselves as justified, and both sides underestimated the determination of the other. As the conflict escalated, the shadow of war grew larger across the region. Spies, envoys, and messengers carried warnings back and forth, each report darker than the last. Rumors spread across neighboring territories that Wallachia was preparing for something unprecedented. Some feared disaster, others admired Vlad's courage. By 1461, the situation had reached its breaking point. The tension that had been building for years, through childhood hostages, political betrayals, shifting alliances, and rising Ottoman expansion, was about to erupt into open conflict. What happened next would define Vlad's legacy and send shockwaves across Europe. His response to Ottoman incursions would not only stun the Sultan, but would become one of the most infamous chapters in medieval history. The stage was set. Wallachia stood on the edge of an empire. Vlad stood at the center of a storm that had been gathering his entire life, and the world was about to witness the lengths to which a ruler would go to defend his land from a force that seemed unstoppable. To understand why Vlad III, later known as Vlad Tepes, made the decisions that shaped his rule, one must first understand the world that formed him. War in the 15th century was not simply a clash of armies. It was a system of survival, a political language, and a way of communication between rulers. For Vlad, warfare was not an occasional necessity. It was the constant foundation upon which Wallachia's existence rested. Every choice he made, every strategy he embraced, and every message he sent to his enemies was rooted in a philosophy shaped by danger, betrayal, and unrelenting pressure from powerful empires. Vlad's idea of warfare was built on a harsh truth. Wallachia was surrounded by enemies. To the south lay the Ottoman Empire, a massive military machine expanding steadily into Europe. To the west lay the Kingdom of Hungary, a potential ally but also a potential threat when political winds shifted. Within Wallachia itself, noble factions schemed for power, each ready to betray the prince if it suited their interests. In such a world, strength was not simply preferred, it was required. Any sign of weakness encouraged invasions, rebellions, and political manipulation. This environment inspired Vlad's first principle of warfare. Psychological power was as important as military force. He believed that fear could be a shield, shaping enemy expectations and discouraging aggression before battles even began. If enemies saw Wallachia as unpredictable or unnervingly fierce, they might hesitate to invade. If boyars feared betraying him, they might finally give the principality the stability it had lacked for generations. Vlad understood that reputation could be sharper than any sword. His early experiences in the Ottoman Empire added another layer to this philosophy. Held as a political hostage during his youth, he observed the discipline, organization, and military structure of the Ottomans up close. He saw firsthand how the empire used both strength and strategy to expand its influence. He witnessed their training, their tactics, and their unwavering confidence. While he later resisted Ottoman rule fiercely, he also learned from them. His understanding of their psychology and military structure became one of his greatest advantages. He knew how they planned campaigns, how they expected enemies to react, and how to exploit the weaknesses hidden behind their powerful exterior. From these lessons, Vlad developed his second principle: warfare must be adaptive and asymmetric. Wallachia could not meet the Ottomans in open battle, where large armies and advanced siege equipment would guarantee Ottoman victory. Instead, Vlad turned to guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, ambushes in forests, nighttime raids, and scorched earth strategies. In environments where Ottoman soldiers were unfamiliar, Wallachians could move like shadows, striking quickly and vanishing before the empire's forces could regroup. These methods were not unusual in the Balkans, but Vlad perfected them with exceptional discipline and coordination. He trained his men not just for combat, but for silence, speed, and the ability to navigate terrain with precision. Forest paths became strategic assets. Marshes, rivers, mountains, and valleys were turned into natural traps. Every part of Wallachia's geography became a tool in Vlad's arsenal. His third principle was rooted in an uncompromising sense of justice and order. Internal unity was essential for external defense. Wallachia had long been weakened by noble infighting. Boyars had a history of switching allegiance between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, often undermining the prince to gain personal advantage. Vlad viewed this instability as the greatest danger to the country. To create a strong state, he believed he had to eliminate corruption, enforce discipline, and make an example of those who undermined Wallachian sovereignty. Under Vlad's rule, nobles who plotted, betrayed, or exploited the peasants found themselves stripped of power, land, or influence. His insistence on justice became legendary, sometimes feared, sometimes respected, but always remembered. Although his methods were severe, they succeeded in bringing a level of internal order that Wallachia had not seen in many years. Roads became safer, laws were enforced, and crime rates dropped dramatically. Vlad's view was simple: a divided principality invited invasion, but a disciplined and united one could survive even against a massive empire. Vlad's philosophy of warfare also extended to diplomacy. He did not believe in blind submission or blind aggression. Instead, he wielded diplomacy like a weapon, offering allegiance when necessary, withholding tribute when appropriate, and manipulating rival powers to maintain Wallachia's independence. He wrote letters filled with political calculation, balancing demands from Hungary and threats from the Ottomans. He knew how to delay invasions, stall negotiations, and mislead foreign ambassadors, all part of a broader strategy to keep Wallachia alive. His diplomatic skill became especially evident in his relationship with Hungary. King Matthias Corvinus was both a potential ally and a potential obstacle. Vlad understood that Hungary needed Wallachia as a buffer state against the Ottomans. At the same time, He knew that Matthias would not hesitate to replace him if it suited Hungarian interests. Thus, Vlad carefully presented himself as a defender of Christianity while also asserting his independence. This balancing act kept Hungary from turning against him, at least for a time, and allowed Vlad to marshal forces and resources he would otherwise have lacked. Another important aspect of Vlad's philosophy was his deep understanding of enemy expectations. He deliberately acted in ways that Ottoman commanders did not anticipate. Ottoman military strategies were built on predictability: march, conquer, station troops, collect tribute. Vlad disrupted this pattern through bold surprises. He launched winter raids when armies typically rested. He struck supply lines instead of fortresses. He targeted smaller units to break morale rather than attacking the main army directly. By refusing to follow conventional strategy, he forced Ottoman commanders to operate in a state of uncertainty. Vlad also understood that the Ottoman army, though powerful, was not immune to fear or exhaustion. He had seen their discipline during his years as a hostage, but he also knew the limits of that discipline. He knew how far they could march before growing weary, how they reacted to surprise attacks, how they managed hunger and disease, and how commanders responded to unexpected setbacks. This knowledge gave him a strategic edge that few other European leaders possessed. But perhaps the most defining element of Vlad's philosophy was his belief that war was not just physical conflict, it was mental warfare. Every move he made was designed to send a message. Every decision was meant to shape the mindset of enemies and allies alike. He aimed to create an aura of unpredictability around Wallachia, a sense that crossing into his territory meant walking into a realm where nothing was guaranteed and danger lurked behind every tree. For Vlad, warfare was not simply about winning battles, it was about shaping the entire political environment. If an enemy feared you before setting foot on your land, then half the battle was already won. If your people remained loyal because they believed you were the only one strong enough to protect them, then stability could endure even in the face of overwhelming threats. And if foreign powers hesitated to attack because they doubted their chances of success, then Wallachia could remain independent despite its small size. In the end, Vlad's unforgiving philosophy of warfare was born from necessity, shaped by experience, and executed with precision. It was a worldview forged in betrayal, trained in captivity, sharpened through political turmoil, and applied against an empire that dwarfed Wallachia in every measurable way. His methods were severe, but they were also strategic, calculated, and deeply intertwined with the reality of 15th-century power struggles. And as the conflict with the Ottoman Empire escalated, this philosophy would soon be tested on a scale that neither Wallachia nor the Ottomans had ever seen before. The mid-1460s marked a moment when tension between Wallachia and the Ottoman Empire transformed from political rivalry into open conflict. For years, Sultan Mehmed II had pushed gradually into Eastern Europe, confident that Wallachia, small, divided, and economically strained, would remain submissive. But Vlad III's refusal to pay tribute, surrender political hostages, or accept Ottoman interference forced the situation toward a breaking point. The capture of Ottoman forces during this period did not occur by accident. It was the product of careful planning, strategic insight, and a uniquely Wallachian understanding of terrain, timing, and psychological warfare. These captures became the spark that ignited one of the most dramatic confrontations of the 15th century. The Ottoman Empire operated with the expectation of predictable compliance. Provinces and vassal states were supposed to meet the Sultan's demands without hesitation. When Vlad withheld tribute, Mehmed II sent envoys and small military detachments to remind Wallachia of its obligations. These troops were not invasion forces but rather enforcement groups, confident, lightly guarded, and certain that Wallachia would not dare defy the Sultan. It was this confidence that Vlad saw as an opportunity. He understood that before the Ottomans could launch a full-scale campaign against him, they needed to measure Wallachia, strength, and determine whether Vlad truly intended rebellion. If he could intercept these early forces and disrupt their confidence, he would shift the momentum of the conflict before it properly began. To execute this strategy, Vlad relied on intelligence networks he had carefully developed. Spies and scouts kept him informed of troop movements near the Danube, the natural border between Wallachia and Ottoman-held territories. The Danube was both a barrier and a gateway, heavily trafficked by traders, soldiers, and messengers. Vlad knew that the Ottomans regularly sent collection officers across the river to gather tribute, supplies, and information. These officers typically traveled with modest escorts, enough to display authority, but not enough to engage in battle. It was precisely this imbalance that Vlad planned to exploit. His preparations began long before the first confrontation. He reinforced Wallachian border outposts, trained his soldiers in rapid deployment, and created a communication system using local riders who could deliver warnings within hours. The forests and hills near the Danube became strategic staging grounds, where soldiers remained hidden among trees, ready to move silently at Vlad's command. These preparations were not merely practical, they were psychological. Vlad wanted his men to understand that they were not defending Wallachia out of fear, but asserting its independence with confidence. The first significant capture occurred when a group of Ottoman officials arrived expecting tribute. They carried records, orders, and the authority of the Sultan. What they did not carry was the readiness for resistance. Vlad met them not with negotiation but with firm refusal. When the officials insisted that they could not return to the Sultan without the expected payment, the confrontation quickly escalated. Vlad's forces seized the officials and their escort with swift precision. This moment sent shockwaves through the Ottoman system of regional control. The Sultan's representatives were not merely symbolic, they were the connective tissue of the empire's administrative machinery. For them to be captured was not simply a local incident, it was a challenge to Ottoman dignity and authority. As news of this spread, Vlad pressed the advantage. He launched a series of coordinated raids along the Danube, targeting outposts, ferries, and small military units that served as the Ottoman frontier presence. These strikes were not random acts of aggression. They were carefully timed to disrupt communication between local commanders and the central Ottoman command. The goal was to make Wallachia appear unpredictable and unmanageable. One of the most decisive moments came during a winter raid, an act that defied conventional military logic. Ottoman forces typically rested during the coldest months, believing no enemy would risk long marches in freezing conditions. Vlad used this assumption to his benefit. With the landscape frozen, rivers passable, and forest trails hardened by frost, his forces moved swiftly and quietly. They targeted Ottoman camps that believed themselves safe for the season. The surprise was total, and numerous soldiers were captured before they could mount any defense. These rapid captures of small groups might appear insignificant at first glance, but they created a cumulative effect that changed the strategic landscape. Every captured unit was a loss of manpower, morale, and local security for the Ottomans. Every missing patrol meant the Sultan received fewer reports about Wallachia's activity. Every intercepted messenger delayed the empire's understanding of the threat Vlad posed. Over time, the Ottomans realized they'd underestimated Wallachia's resolve. Three key consequences emerged from these events. 1. The Ottomans could no longer treat Wallachia as a passive vassal. Mehmed II had many enemies across Europe, but most either submitted or were quickly defeated. Wallachia's resistance was inconvenient, but more importantly, it was embarrassing. The empire depended on the perception of invincibility. If a small principality successfully defied them, other regions might feel encouraged to resist as well. 2. Vlad gained valuable intelligence. Captured Ottoman soldiers provided unexpected strategic advantages. Through interrogation, Vlad learned about Ottoman military schedules, supply chains, and planned movements. His understanding of the empire's weaknesses deepened, allowing him to refine his defensive and offensive strategies. 3. The captures forced the Sultan to respond. What began as scattered incidents soon became a pattern that the Ottomans could not ignore. The Sultan realized that this was not a border skirmish, but an organized resistance that threatened Ottoman influence in the Balkans. It was clear that a small enforcement detachment would not be enough. If the Sultan wanted to reassert control, he would have to prepare a large-scale military response. Meanwhile, inside Wallachia, the Captu res strengthened Vlad's position. Nobles who had doubted him now saw a ruler capable of standing against a great empire. Peasants who feared Ottoman domination took courage from the prince's boldness. Vlad's authority grew as news of his early victories spread, lending legitimacy to his claim that Wallachia could be independent if it stood united. However, Vlad understood that these successes also carried a price. The capture of Ottoman forces made peaceful negotiation impossible. The Sultan would not forgive such defiance. A storm was coming, and Vlad's captures were the thunder before the lightning. Still, for Vlad, this was a necessary risk. He believed that Wallachia had spent too many years bowing to foreign masters. The capture of Ottoman troops was not simply a military act, it was a declaration of identity. It announced that Wallachia would no longer be a silent frontier, but a principality determined to chart its own course. As Mehmed II prepared his retaliation, Europe watched with uneasy fascination. No one knew how a small principality could withstand the might of the Ottoman Empire. But one thing was certain: the captures marked a turning point. They transformed tension into open war, defiance into legend, and Vlad III into a figure whose actions would echo across centuries. Vlad III's reputation as one of the most feared rulers in medieval Europe did not emerge from battlefield victories alone. It was shaped by the methods of discipline, judgment, and punishment he employed, methods that stunned allies and enemies alike. These practices were not random acts of cruelty, as later legends often exaggerated. They were part of a deliberate philosophy of governance and warfare, grounded in the belief that a stable and secure Wallachia required unshakable authority. To Vlad, order came not from negotiation or compromise, but from clear consequences for betrayal, eruption, and aggression. His approach may appear extreme by modern standards, but in the context of 15th-century regional politics, where kingdoms were torn apart by internal rivalries, his methods carried strategic purpose. Wallachia, long plagued by disloyal boyars, banditry, and foreign interference, required a strengthened central authority, in Vlad's view. His first objective was to eliminate the factionalism that had broken the principality for decades. Boyars had conspired against rulers, shifted allegiance between foreign powers, and disrupted governance whenever it benefited them. Vlad believed such instability made Wallachia vulnerable to conquest. To secure unity, he enforced strict laws and firm consequences for corruption, treason, or deceit. Punishments were public and unmistakable, designed to serve as warnings to others. He believed that only through unmistakable justice could he prevent further cycles of rebellion. Foreign chroniclers, especially Saxon merchants from Transylvania, later reported exaggerated stories of Vlad's harshness, but many of their accounts reflected political bias. Vlad had targeted merchants involved in illegal trade, smuggling, or manipulation of Wallachian markets, actions that threatened the principality's economic stability. When these merchants resisted his regulations or used their influence to undermine his authority, they faced penalties meant to demonstrate that economic power could not overshadow political rule. Transylvanian chroniclers later transformed these punishments into dark legends, but at the time, such measures reinforced that Wallachia's economy would not be dictated by foreign interests. Vlad's justice system was built on a set of clear principles: loyalty must be rewarded, disloyalty punished, and lawbreakers deterred by the certainty of consequences, while other rulers relied on fines or negotiated settlements. Vlad believed that ambiguous punishments invited further disobedience. In contrast, a firm response established immediate order. Travelers of the era wrote that under Vlad's rule, roads became safe, theft nearly vanished, and peasants could move without fear of bandit attacks, an unusual accomplishment in a region historically troubled by lawlessness. One famous story, often repeated by chroniclers, described a golden cup placed at a public fountain in vs.The, Vlad's capital. The cup was left undefended, yet no one dared steal it throughout Vlad's rule. Even if this account is embellished, it reflects a central truth. The prince successfully cultivated a climate where crime became exceedingly rare. This stability allowed Wallachia to strengthen economically and militarily, preparing it for the looming conflict with the Ottoman Empire, When dealing with Ottoman prisoners or agents, Vlad's methods were deeply strategic. He knew the Ottomans valued discipline and viewed rebellion as a direct insult to imperial dignity. By imposing severe punishment on those who threatened Wallachian sovereignty, especially spies, tribute collectors, or military units crossing the Danube, Vlad aimed to send a message that Wallachia was not a vassal to be intimidated. His actions were geopolitical statements, not isolated acts of violence. Each decision was intended to inform the Sultan that Wallachia would not be easily controlled. These methods also played a psychological role in military strategy. Before invading a territory, an empire like the Ottomans relied on scouting units, informants and tribute collectors to gather information. By targeting these groups, Vlad disrupted the empire's intelligence network and created uncertainty. Ottoman commanders, unsure of the risks of entering Wallachia, became hesitant. Troops unfamiliar with the territory grew anxious about what awaited them. Vlad recognized that fear was a powerful ally. If the psychological cost of marching into Wallachia became too high, the Ottomans would be forced to reconsider their approach. Yet Vlad's methods were not used indiscriminately. He often distinguished between ordinary soldiers acting under orders and individuals who had committed acts of aggression, treachery, or criminal behavior. Captured soldiers who surrendered willingly were sometimes released or used in negotiations. Those who participated in raids, extortion, or intimidation of locals faced stricter consequences. Vlad used punishment to reinforce the principle that Wallachian civilians were under his protection and that threats to them would be met with firm retaliation. Vlad's approach to justice also influenced the structure of his military. Unlike traditional feudal armies that relied heavily on noble contingents, Vlad cultivated a more centralized military force. Loyalty to the prince became the primary requirement for service. Soldiers understood that discipline was essential and that their ruler expected absolute commitment to Wallachia's defense. His punishments for disobedience, desertion, or cowardice were strict, but they fostered an army known for its unity and resilience. The Wallachian military of Vlad's era became one of the most cohesive and reliable forces in the region. These methods also shaped diplomatic relations. Foreign emissaries visiting Vlad's court understood they were entering a principality ruled by a leader who valued respect, directness, and order. One well-known account involved Ottoman envoys who refused to remove their head coverings in the prince's presence, citing religious custom. Instead of treating the incident as simple cultural misunderstanding, Vlad interpreted it as a symbolic refusal to acknowledge Wallachian sovereignty. His stern reaction, though later retold with dramatic embellishment, served a diplomatic purpose. It made clear to visiting delegations that Wallachia was not subordinate to foreign courts. European rulers observed Vlad's methods with a mixture of admiration and fear. Some praised him as a defender of Christian Europe, applauding his ability to resist Ottoman expansion. Others saw him as excessively severe, uncomfortable with the intensity of his discipline, but regardless of personal opinion, few denied that Vlad's approach achieved results. Wallachia, despite its size, held its independence for longer than many expected. Even after his death, the fear he instilled in enemies lingered, influencing how they treated the principality. One of the greatest consequences of Vlad's strict system of justice was the unity it produced during the height of Ottoman aggression. When Mehmed II launched his massive campaign against Wallachia, expecting a divided and weakened country, he found instead a principality whose people were unusually disciplined and loyal to their leader. They were prepared to defend their homeland not just out of fear, but because they understood that Vlad's authority had brought unprecedented order and stability. The stories of Vlad's punishments, often used today as sensational tales, originally served a very different purpose. They were tools of deterrence, propaganda, and political communication. Some were exaggerated, others carefully crafted by foreign chroniclers with their own agendas. But at their core, they reflect the reality of a ruler determined to protect his country at all costs. To Vlad, discipline was not cruelty, it was protection. Justice was not vengeance, it was the foundation of a stable state. By the time the Ottoman Empire mobilized its massive army to confront him, Vlad had already shaped the battlefield through fear, reputation, and psychological strategy. His methods of punishment, far from being isolated acts, were part of the broader system that prepared Wallachia for one of the most decisive struggles in its history. Vlad III's campaign against the Ottoman Empire intensified, and as word of his unyielding methods spread across Europe and beyond, the world reacted with a mixture of awe, fear, and bewilderment. No ruler of his era provoked such powerful emotions or such contradictory interpretations. To some, Vlad was a heroic defender of his homeland, a prince who dared to confront one of the most formidable empires in history. To others, he was a figure whose severity defied understanding, a ruler whose pursuit of order came at a cost that many found difficult to reconcile. Regardless of perspective, the reactions he inspired shaped not only his legacy, but the political dynamics of an entire region. The first group to react strongly to Vlad's actions was the Ottoman Empire. For the Sultan and his commanders, Vlad's defiance represented more than a military inconvenience. It was a direct challenge to imperial authority. Ottoman strategy relied on the assumption that smaller states would comply with demands, especially those located along strategically important frontiers. Vlad's refusal to pay tribute, return political hostages, or allow Ottoman envoys to exercise their traditional authority shattered this expectation. His bold raids across the Danube, his capture of Ottoman troops, and his symbolic punishments of foreign agents forced the empire to reconsider its approach. Within the Ottoman military structure, reports of Vlad's resistance created an atmosphere of frustration and disbelief. Commanders who had dismissed Wallachia as a minor border territory now faced the reality that their forces had been outmaneuvered by a ruler who understood their tactics intimately. Ordinary soldiers, unfamiliar with Wallachian terror, and unnerved by stories spreading through the ranks, began to view the region as a place where the rules of warfare did not fully apply. This psychological shift disrupted Ottoman confidence, compelling the empire to commit far more troops and resources than anticipated. Meanwhile, in the courts of Europe, news of Vlad's actions traveled swiftly, carried by merchants, ambassadors, and at times by enemies eager to shape the narrative. Hungary, the most immediate neighbor and occasional overlord, had a complex reaction. King Matthias Corvinus recognized the strategic importance of Vlad's resistance. By confronting the Ottomans directly, Vlad served as a buffer that protected Hungarian lands from immediate encroachment. At the same time, Matthias viewed Vlad as unpredictable, an ally whose extreme tactics could either strengthen or destabilize regional politics. This ambivalence played a major role in the diplomatic exchanges between the two leaders. At first, Matthias praised Vlad as a champion of Christianity, sending letters acknowledging his courage against the Ottomans. But as Vlad's methods drew criticism from neighboring Saxon communities, Matthias found himself pressured to distance Hungary from the Wallachian prince. The king's political calculations eventually led him to imprison Vlad for a time, though the decision was influenced as much by internal intrigue as by Vlad's actions. Even in captivity, however, Vlad's name carried such weight that European nobles visited him out of curiosity, seeking to determine whether he was a defender or a tyrant. Western Europe reacted differently. Countries farther from the Ottoman frontier, such as Germany, Italy, and the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, heard of Vlad's deeds primarily through printed pamphlets and merchant accounts. Many of these stories sensationalized his methods for dramatic effect. Although printing was still a relatively new technology, it played a crucial role in spreading Vlad's reputation across the continent. Pamphlets mixed fact with fiction, transforming reports of his harsh justice into tales of monstrous extremes. To readers in distant lands, Vlad became less a political figure and more a symbol, an embodiment of both the brutality and the heroism associated with resisting a powerful empire. Ironically, these exaggerated stories contributed to his fame more than the political events themselves. European audiences were fascinated by rulers who challenged the status quo, and Vlad's refusal to submit to the Sultan placed him in a unique category. He became a subject of heated debate. Some praised his courage, others recoiled at his severity, but few remained indifferent. Closer to home, the people of Wallachia responded with a mixture of fear and gratitude. Many peasants regarded Vlad as the first ruler in decades who genuinely prioritized their safety over the interests of nobles or foreign powers. Banditry decreased dramatically. Roads became safer, and the principality enjoyed a degree of order that had long been missing. For rural communities accustomed to instability, the security Vlad provided was invaluable. Stories of his discipline, though harsh, were often interpreted as necessary steps in restoring unity. Many locals viewed him as a protector, a leader who demanded much but delivered stability in return. The boyars, however, reacted with less appreciation. Many of them had suffered under Vlad's reforms, losing privileges that allowed them to manipulate Wallachia's political structure for personal gain. Their resentment fueled alliances with external powers, especially when Vlad's rule threatened their influence. Some fled to Transylvania, where they aligned with Saxon merchants already hostile to Vlad due to trade disagreements. Together, these groups helped spread stories that emphasized the darker aspects of Vlad's rule, hoping to undermine his legitimacy abroad. These political tensions contributed to the formation of the contrasting narratives that survive today. Supporters constructed the image of Vlad as a national hero, a ruler who united a troubled principality and defied an empire. Opponents crafted a portrayal of him as a dangerous tyrant, exaggerating his punishments to an almost mythic level. The truth, as with many historical figures, lies somewhere in between. But the polarized reactions show how deeply his actions affected those around him. Beyond Europe, even regions with limited involvement in Balkan politics eventually heard of the Wallachian prince. The sheer scale of the Ottoman Empire meant that news of frontier conflicts reached merchants, scholars, and diplomats in far-off lands. Some accounts depicted Vlad as an enemy of the empire, others as a formidable adversary worthy of respect. Though these reactions were often detached from the realities of the conflict, they contributed to the growing aura surrounding his name. Perhaps the most enduring consequence of the world's reaction to Vlad was the transformation of his identity from a historical figure into a legend. Over time, chroniclers embellished stories, mixing real events with folklore. As centuries passed, these tales merged with local myths about spirits, supernatural beings, and haunt. Places. Eventually, Western writers centuries later reinterpreted these stories in ways that would give rise to the modern fictional figure associated with his name. Although this transformation occurred long after his death, it demonstrates how powerful the reactions to Vlad's rule were, so powerful that they inspired myths that still exist today. In the immediate aftermath of his campaigns, however, the reaction that mattered most was the one from the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan, angered by the embarrassment of failed expeditions and the loss of troops, committed to a massive invasion aimed at removing Vlad from power permanently. Yet even this reaction, rooted in frustration and a desire for retribution, underscored how deeply Vlad had challenged one of the world's most formidable forces. Few rulers of his size and resources ever provoked such a response. Ultimately, the world's reaction to Vlad III was shaped by the same qualities that defined his life: intensity, decisiveness, and a refusal to accept half measures. Allies admired him, enemies feared him, and observers were left struggling to understand him. His legacy became a mirror reflecting the perspectives of those who wrote about him, sometimes accurate, sometimes distorted, but always dramatic. In the centuries that followed, Vlad's name remained a symbol of resistance, discipline, and power, Whether hailed as a hero or condemned as a tyrant, he left a mark on history that few rulers of small principalities ever achieve. The world reacted to Vlad III not because he was ordinary, but because he was extraordinary, an uncompromising leader whose actions transcended his time and continue to spark debate even today.